Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Geri T. I'm going to be managing and sort of running this office hours today. My background is that I worked at Harvard Business School for many years, and I worked in the MBA admissions office. So hopefully I have lots of good experience to kind of share with you today. You can see a little bit about me and my background there. Right now, I'm working full time as a professional MBA coach through Leland, which I've actually been coaching for a few years, and I absolutely love it. And I actually worked in the admissions office for about 8 years total. So got a chance to read hundreds of applications and do hundreds and hundreds of interviews. So my hope today is that I can share some, basic tips with you, some not actually basic, some I think kind of next level tips, if you will. We'll get to that in a second, and then also be able to answer some of your questions today, because I know that's why a lot of you are here. So we'll start off with these HBS interview tips, and I'm calling it sort of beyond the basics, because I know that obviously you all are very bright people. You can do some of the basic research on your own. I'm sure you've seen lots of information out there onto how do I prepare for my HBS interview? What are things I need to think about? So I tried to think about, hey, what's like the next level that you're just not going to get that's like super obvious, right? These are the things that are a little bit kind of happening in the minds of the admissions committee person, or anyone who's going to be interviewing that day with you. Sometimes there's an observer in the room as well, which we can talk about. But these are the things that they're also thinking about, that they're trying to get to in that interview. So I'm going to briefly go through these, but again, I won't spend too much time because I know you all have great questions for me. So I want to get to that. But first is sort of know your whys. And this basically is kind of core to everything that's going on in the interview. It's easy for AdCom to kind of see the what. Here's what I've done. They can look at your resume and they can see, oh, okay, this is what he or she has done. This is what's going on. This is where they worked. This is where they went to school. But what they can't get from that application oftentimes is the why. And so you want to be able to think about that sort of next level of things, not just, hey, can I talk about what I did, but can I talk about why I did it? So, why did I pick this company to work for? Why did I decide to major in that major? Even the fun stuff, why do I like to cook? So kind of thinking about, could you have that, deeper conversation? So just know your whys. The next thing is to be vulnerable. And this is something that you might not necessarily think about. But, the way I think of it is that, I think people sometimes go into this interview with HBS and they think, I need to be perfect. I need to be amazing. I need to show every achievement. I need to show that I'm always the best. But if you think about yourself and the people that you enjoy being around and the people that you like meeting, it's oftentimes because those people that you're talking to are real, they're honest, they're able to laugh at themselves, they're able to talk about times when they weren't perfect, when things went wrong. And so by being vulnerable, I mean, that you want to be able to be honest with somebody. It's okay in this interview, to say to your interviewer, hey, here's something that went wrong. Here's a time when I, wasn't the best, or when I disappointed myself or someone else. Like, these are things that actually endear you to the interviewer. And so I think it's, just something to keep in mind, that you are not expected. And in fact, I would say it actually can make the interview even better when you are not that sort of perfect, person who's done everything right. So, feel free to be honest and vulnerable. Okay, share your learnings. So I think when I'm talking about share the learnings, what HBS interviewers are looking for here is introspection, right? A little bit like that first one where I'm talking about know your whys. They want to know not just the what you did, but what did you take away from it, right? What were the learnings? If you look back at your experiences, what can you say you learned that now you take forward in your life? So, think about stories where things in your life or experiences where you've really grown, as a person, where you learned a lesson along the way. Maybe it was a setback. Maybe it was something that went really, really well, but times where you've really taken something away, you've taken a lesson, and it's something that's stayed with you and you use it in your life going forward. So I think that's what, I mean by share learnings. You want to, again, it's sort of that next level down of depth, right? Of thinking. And that's also something they're really trying to get to. Are you someone that not just goes through life and goes through their experiences kind of 1, 2, 3, but also learns along the way and takes those learnings with them? And then give others credit. So it's interesting during this process, again, I think there's an idea that I have to kind of take credit for all the things, right? I have to show everything that I've really accomplished and done. But sometimes what can happen accidentally is that you end up saying I so often, and you sometimes could get through a whole interview forgetting to kind of mention other people. Forgetting to mention, oh, this was my team. This team that I was on was amazing, and we accomplished X, Y, Z. It doesn't mean that you're not going to sometimes say I. You definitely are going to say I sometimes, but you just want to keep it in mind. It's a great thing to be able to talk about. I had this amazing manager, and she taught me this. Or I have a mentor that I go to really often, and there's something that they said to me that really stuck with me. So just being cognizant of like not just sort of talking about I, but also including, being able to be aware and mention when other folks have had an impact on you, and that other people are part of your success as well. I think that's something important to keep in mind. Prepare second and third level answers. You might have seen something about this kind of thing if you've done a little prep work on how to prep for the HBS interview. But this is all about sort of, a thing that HBS interviewers sometimes like to do to kind of dive a little bit deeper. So they'll ask you a seemingly pretty straightforward question, right? Hey, let's talk about your career plans after you graduate from the MBA program. And, you get through this whole amazing explanation of what your plans are and what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. And then they say to you, okay, well, what else would you like to do? And you haven't necessarily thought about like, oh, what else, right? Or a second level of that. Or it could be simple, like, hey, tell me about a book you just read, and you talk about that book, and then they say, okay, give me another one. Or what's the biggest lesson you've learned from a recent manager? And then they say, okay, give me another one. So it's just one of those things where they're kind of pushing a little to try and get you beyond that top level answer, because they kind of know those are the prepared answers, right? They want to see how you do on your toes when you're pushed a little more for like a second or a third response. So just something to think about. Most folks can kind of do this on the fly fairly well, but just so it doesn't take you off guard, it's kind of something to think through. And then last thing before we move on to your questions is let go of the script. So again, a big part of this interview is that the interviewer is trying to get to know who you are, right? Not just what you've done. So the way they're trying to do that is kind of to understand your personality a little bit. They're imagining you in a classroom, right, of 90 people. And are you going to be someone that other people want to be around? Are you likable? Are you charismatic? Do you have a perspective? Do you have something interesting to say? And the way that comes through, I think, is when you are really you let everything go once you get into that interview, and you are just, honest, and you are just yourself. So I think sometimes it can be tricky if you go in with some very clear goals. I need to be able to say X, Y, and Z. I need to make sure I mention A, B, and C. And when you do that, I think sometimes it can feel inadvertently, you can kind of feel scripted. You can feel a little bit robotic. And that means that then sort of your personality is not coming through. And I think the worst case scenario is, walking out of an interview as an AdCom member, sort of walking out of an interview and saying, I don't really feel like I got to know them. I don't know what they're really like, because they really stuck to their script. So you just want to make sure that you feel comfortable. Once you walk in there, let everything go, try and be real, try and be in the moment, and let your personality shine through. Okay, so those are all my tips. I'm all set with that. And then we can move on to your questions. And so you are welcome to put any questions that you have in the chat, and I will do my best to respond. One thing I will mention, though, is that if you can try and keep your questions sort of a little bit higher level, things that might apply to the group of folks that are in here today, that are on this call. If you get too kind of detailed, too specific into your own application, your own particulars, it may not be relevant to the rest of the crew. So if you're able to kind of try and keep it a little bit high level to make sure that it's worthwhile for other folks to be listening to as well. Okay, I haven't seen any questions yet. There we go. Okay, what are some of the tips and things to note when attending the interview on campus? Okay, I love this question. I think some folks, right, you're going into that day and you're very focused on your interview and doing well, as you should be. That's super important. But I do think it is worthwhile also to kind of see what the students are like as you walk around campus, see what people are talking about when you go from place to place. Get a sense for when you walk through, this big, gorgeous building, Spangler, are people huddled and working together? What does that look like? What does that feel like? You get a sense for the culture. And I think also one thing kind of a little bit more operationally, but if you're spending some time on campus and you're going to be going to a class and sitting in and listening, take note of who the professor is, take note of the case that might be being talked about that day, because those are things that you might want to mention during your interview, or you might kind of mention in your post-interview reflection. So that's something to kind of consider too. So just a couple of things to think about when you're on campus. Okay, lots coming in now. How does Harvard weigh the interview against other parts of the application? Yeah, this one's so interesting because it would be great if there was sort of a very clear formula, right? So the application counts for 75% and the interview accounts for 25% or something. But there's all these factors that kind of weigh into that. So what I can tell you is that about 50% of the people who get to interview get admitted, right? So you're kind of halfway home. And so it matters, right? It's important. But the thing that is a tougher kind of factor to consider is that it's not just how you do. You might do great in your interview and have a really good conversation and feel like you killed it. But what also matters that's out of your hands is how many other people coming from your sector, right, your industry or your part of the world or a similar background are also interviewing and also do well. So that part of it, obviously, you can't kind of touch, right? All you can control is how you do on that given day. But there are these sort of factors, that are kind of beyond your 30-minute interview. So I would say it is, super important. They do want to make sure that they're bringing people in that are the right fit, that they can see kind of sitting in the classroom. And like I said earlier, sort of sharing a perspective. They can do that clearly. They can communicate well. They can communicate efficiently. And they have something interesting to share, with their classmates. So that's kind of how I would, talk about that one. Will AdCom ask us to walk through our resume? If yes, how long should be spent answering this question? Is it the typical 3 to 5 minutes, or should we be more concise? This is a great question. So it depends. It depends on your interviewer. So there will definitely be some interviewers who kick things off with hey, tell me a little bit about yourself. That's usually something like that. Or introduce yourself to me, and they'll kind of keep it broad. And so I think those are great questions to kick off with. It's kind of great it gives the interviewee a chance to just talk immediately. And for the AdCom member to sit back and listen. So, I think that's why they sometimes like that question. Not everyone will get it. It just depends on, if your interviewer likes that question. But how you want to handle that, I think, is, 3 to 5 minutes is a really long time. And it's kind of, it doesn't sound like it is, but that's a big chunk of the interview, right? If it's only 30 minutes, and you want to make sure you're getting to all kinds of stuff. So I would say you want to kind of aim for like a minute and a half, maybe. That's about right. And certainly in kind of a 90-second response, you can't get to everything for sure. So I would sort of prepare a little bit ahead of time and say, okay, if somebody asked me that question, how would I respond? And just kind of pull out a few things, something from your background and something from your personal life, right? So, hey, I'm from this part of the world. I come from a family of 6, I'm the oldest, boy in my, or girl and kind of in my family, that kind of thing, a little bit of like a personal family kind of background thing. And then, you might kind of touch briefly on, I went to school here, because I just loved this about the school, something kind of interesting. And then you jump into, right now I'm working at X and it's been amazing. I'm currently working on this project, doing XYZ. Share kind of one thing, right? That the interviewer can kind of remember about you, right? Like you're just kind of picking a couple things from each, part of your life and pulling something interesting out and sharing that, and then you kind of, finish up in that, 90-second time frame. It's not meant to be comprehensive. By no means could you in 90 seconds or even in 3 minutes be able to tell, the whole story. So I think a better approach is, like I said, kind of pick one kind of interesting thing out from those different sort of buckets of your life. And that's something that someone can really listen to and remember, versus a whole list of everything you've done in your whole resume. So I think that's kind of a good approach there. This person said, jumping ahead, what are some aspects of a good post-interview reflection? What are aspects of a poor one? Okay, so I think this is, really smart to think about ahead of time. They will give you a prompt, to follow. So I think, you want to take a look at that. It's usually pretty broad. They'll just ask if there's anything else you want to share, and any kind of opinions that you had on the process, kind of something broad like that. And my advice on that front is that a good post-interview reflection to your question is not overly long. This is not your chance to kind of rewrite everything, right? And retell your story. They've already read the app, they've already interviewed you. Now is a chance to kind of short and sweet, just kind of pull, respond to the prompt, briefly in a couple paragraphs, and that's it. You're not trying to kind of relitigate your whole profile, if you will, or your whole application. And so you're going to pull something from the interview. Typically they'll ask, what part of the interview sort of resonated most with you. So you'll pick one thing out. You'll talk about that a little bit, and then you'll talk a little bit about like, here's what this whole process has meant to me. I'm applying to school, etc. And then that's it. I mean, it's a couple paragraphs, and that's really all. And you're moving on. So I think short and sweet, answering the prompt clearly. Not trying to kind of put a ton of new information or reiterate other information in there. I think that's what makes for a good one. And the poor one is sort of the opposite of that. I think going too long, trying to kind of push too much information in there. You're really, honestly, you're not going to convince the admissions director to admit you through your post-interview reflection. So that this is a tiny piece of the overall application. It's not a make or break, honestly. So the big chunks are the application and the interview. So, don't feel like this is your kind of another essay and another chance to kind of really talk yourself up. It's really supposed to be just a quick, response to how that interview went, and sort of, the reflection from that interview. So I would say that's kind of what I think in terms of good and not as good post-interview reflections. How would you recommend preparing in a way that helps us not feel over-scripted or over-rehearsed? Okay, that is a really fair question, because so much of what you see is like practice, 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 right? And yet here I am saying like, don't be scripted. And so I think the best way I think to do this is you can find, various sets of questions, right, that are often asked. You can find those online. And I think you want to just, you practice with a friend, you can practice with a mentor, you can do some official, practicing with a coach like me. And, you get a chance to speak out loud your answers. And I think, you do that a few times, and that's it. You're not writing down, here's what I want to say. Here's my top 4 bullets and how I'm going to respond, to this kind of a question, and then memorizing those 4 bullets. You're getting asked the question in a real sort of mock environment, like I said, with a mentor or a friend or a coach, and you're running through it and you're speaking just as you would in a real interview. And if it goes well, then you go, great, done. You're not memorizing anything. You're not trying to, again, hit a certain number of bullets, and saying things exactly in this manner. You're simply sort of practicing your story out loud. And I think you do that a couple times, and by the time you get to the real interview, you're now sort of comfortable. You've done it a couple times. And I think, that's the difference between like memorization and practice, right? You're not trying to memorize. You're not going in there with a script. You're not going in there with, hey, these 5 things are 5 things I have to say. That all goes away. There are, in my mind, like, this is not the time to kind of walk in with an agenda. It's your time to kind of listen, because if you listen closely, they're telling you kind of what they are curious about. They're telling you what information they want and need, versus you going in there with like an assumed agenda, which may not align at all with what their questions are. So I think, it's a subtle, but hopefully that's a little bit of information that will help explain kind of the difference between, overly rehearsed or overly scripted. What is the best way to respond to practice second and third level responses? I think, you can, again, do some of these mocks, even if it's somebody who, who you're close with or you're not close with, a friend, somebody from work, and tell them ahead of time, hey, like, ask me these questions, but then, push on me, ask me for the next, ask me a follow-up question, keep asking me follow-up questions, and see how you do. You might be better at it than you actually imagine. It's something you're kind of thinking about naturally, but I think having someone, again, do this to you, kind of do some of this practice, like, you can even tell them ahead of time, yeah, like, don't let me get away with my first answer, kind of push, ask me for a follow-up, ask me for a second version, and let them kind of come up with how they do that, because obviously every interviewer is going to do it a little differently if they do it right. Again, this is one of those, like, some interviewers love to do this, others less so. So, it's, you may see a lot of it, you may see none of it. It's just kind of TBD. But I think a good way to practice is, again, and a coach I think can certainly help in this front, because they've done a lot of these mock interviews, so they kind of know how to do it. So I think, this is one of those places where maybe a mock interview with a coach could be useful, because they're going to kind of push on this a little bit and give you some experience in it. And then you're going to kind of get a sense for, like, oh, okay, I can do this. I'm good on my feet. I feel pretty confident about this. Or, hey, this is something I have to practice a little bit more. Again, whether I do that again with another coach or I do it with a friend. But I think it's just one of those things that you can't sort of prepare for every question. It's kind of not possible. But the more you practice this kind of thing, just the better you're going to get at it. So I wish there was a more exacting answer, but I think that's kind of the best way to think about it. Okay. I think I recognize this name. I'm curious to hear how you would handle not knowing an answer for those second level questions. For example, they ask about an industry trend and you don't know about it. Is it okay to say, I don't know? So yes, it is definitely okay to say, I don't know. I think it's better to say, I don't know, and have the interview continue and move on to another question than it is to, make something up, right? Because I think sometimes that's you feel like you have to say something and you feel like, I need to come up with something. And so you start to talk, and then that talking turns into rambling. And so a much better way to handle it, if you really can't come up with anything, is to say, you know what, that one's tough. I'm not really sure I have an answer. And then, the interviewer will just kind of say, okay, I get it. Let's move on. I think moving on, getting to something else where you're able to kind of, show another side to you, answer another good question, help smooth that out, versus, spending additional time on something where you're like, this isn't going well. I'm kind of rambling, and yeah, better just to move on. It's totally okay to say, I don't know. They know they're pushing, right? They know they're making it hard. So it's not unexpected that sometimes they're going to get an I don't know. It's not the end of the world. How long should you spend answering each question? I get this a lot. This question comes up a lot, which is totally fair. I think it depends. I know it depends. It's hard, but sometimes questions are bigger, broader, right? They're asking you to explain a project at work. And so, in a bigger kind of question like that, where you have to walk someone through something, there is an understanding that it's going to take a little longer for you to answer. And so you may have sort of a minute to answer that. But if you're being asked a fairly basic question, what do you like to do when you have free time? That can be more of like a 30 or a 45-second answer, right? So you kind of have to judge a little bit based on the type of question that's being asked. Certainly they understand that if they're asking you a big question about, industry trends, like someone mentioned, what are the top 3 things happening in your sector right now? Well, that's going to take a while. That's a big answer. So they're going to, I think taking a minute or a minute and a half to respond is fine. But again, some, simpler ones, I think it's completely fine to take a shorter, amount of time. And if they want more, if you finish up and it's 30 seconds in and and you're not sure, should I keep going? Should I not keep going? Did I do enough? It's always fair to say, hey, would you like me to continue? I'm happy to. And they'll give you a nod. They'll either say, yeah, please, or they'll say, no, I think I got it. So if you're not sure, it's completely fine to just kind of do a check-in with your interviewer and ask if they want more, or if you kind of gave enough. Some, I think, interviewers, you'll kind of know, you'll get a sense they're listening, they're happy to hear me go and continue. And others, won't give you much. So it's hard to know where you are with them. And again, in those cases, it's great just to kind of do a check-in, and that way, yep, they want me to keep going, they want more, or no, they don't. That's always a great way to handle it. For people from non-traditional backgrounds, in this case, medical, will the AdCom be someone with professional knowledge of the industry? So very likely they won't be. So they do not sort of align people's backgrounds with the people's, background of the AdCom or the interviewer. So it could very well be that, if you're coming from consulting, you might be talking to an AdCom interviewer who came from consulting themselves, a few years ago. Or you could have somebody who, in this case, if it's a medical or a healthcare background, you might also have someone who came from that, but it's also highly likely that the person you're speaking to does not have that background. And I think it's best to assume the person you're talking to does not have particular knowledge of your, sector and experience and company. So it's always a good idea to kind of, explain things in advance. So if you're, you always want to make sure you're avoiding jargon, but if you're explaining something complex or technical, again, this is one of those times where you can do kind of a check-in with the interviewer, and you kind of say, oh, let me explain this to you. And if they get it and they already know, they might say, oh, okay, no, I'm totally familiar with it. Great, then But if not, I think it's better to err on the side of over explaining, so that you make sure that interviewer is following along and they're not lost, right? You definitely don't want them to get lost. So always better to give them background information and say, oh, let me give you a little bit of background on what's happening here before I dive in. Great. Now they have the foundation set. Now they understand what you're about to talk about. I think that's the best way to go. You always assume they don't know. And if they do, they'll jump in and tell you, and they'll be like, oh, actually, I spent 10 years working in, medical devices. I'm super familiar. Then it's great. Now you can really have kind of an in-depth conversation with this person. So, it just kind of depends on who you get, but there is not sort of like I said, an aligning of the AdCom's background with the person who's interviewing. So it's just, if it happens, it's just luck. Okay. I know that all MBA programs are looking for excellent candidates, but what kind of candidates are HBS looking for especially? What hidden preferences do they have? So it's interesting. I think, in many ways, they're not really hidden. If you notice, there were some updates recently that were done on the HBS website, and they kind of lay out some, pretty clearly kind of, here's what we care about. Here's what we're looking for. And they also lay that out pretty clearly in the essay questions that they ask, right? So, based on that essay question about curiosity, this is super important to them, right? They want people who are intellectually curious, who, are super excited about learning from people from all over the world, from all different sectors. They want people who have, breadth, who are not sort of narrow and can only see things in one way, because that's kind of what the PACE method is all about. It's what the classroom is all about. So we know they care a lot about people who are curious, people who follow those curiosities, right? Who can talk about so many different things because they've investigated lots of different things. That just makes you more of an interesting candidate, an interesting person in the classroom. You're going to look at those cases with a different perspective. You're going to raise the level of conversation and discussion in the classroom. So, we know that's one of those things they care about, right? So, and there's a couple other of those that they list on their website, sort of, here's what the things that we are looking for, so they're not really so much hidden. They kind of put them out there. And it's just a matter of, taking a look at that and going, okay, let me map, where do I have for each of these things? I think there's kind of 3 buckets right now, for each of those buckets, where do I have things that fall into each? So if I'm kind of asked about those things, or even if I'm not asked, but as I'm talking in my interview, how do I showcase that I have these skills that we know they care about, that I'm that kind of a person, right? So I think that's a good way to do it. It's just kind of think through, an idea or two, a story or two, an experience or two that sort of falls into each of those buckets, and just know that that's something that your interviewer is thinking about in the back of their head as they're getting to know you. Like, is this someone who I see as intellectually curious? Like, can I see that from the way that they're talking and the way that they pull in, ideas from different, places that they've been, or different experiences that they've had, or, these are kind of things that I think you want to think about kind of as, before you walk into that interview. So, again, don't kind of overthink it, but I think they do a pretty good job of kind of being clear cut, or like, these are the things that we want in our folks. Okay. Does the admission interview differ for 2+2 applicants? So no, it does not. The expectations are a little different for 2+2 applicants. Obviously, you're not coming from the same number of years of work experience, right? You're coming most likely directly from undergrad or a graduate program. So they reset their expectations a little bit, right? You aren't expected to have the same level of business knowledge, and certainly not the same level of experience. But in terms of how they do it, the same. They're reading your application, they're, creating specific questions for you, they're really tailoring those questions, all those things sort of in terms of, what they care about in terms and their students, those are all the same. So, very similar. They just kind of adjust, given that your background is different. Um, okay. There are more on here, but I believe that we are sort of at the end of our time. um, Amanda, what do you think?
If you want to take maybe one more of the
Okay.
stronger questions, and for everyone
Yeah.
else, I'm going to send a link in a minute to meet with our strategy team, and you can discuss with them your current questions, and they can match you with someone based off of your budget and goals and exactly what you're looking for.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you. Okay. So we'll take one more. I'm sorry if I don't get to everyone. Um, this is kind of a fun one. What would you say an absolutely terrible, totally bombed interview looks like? What are some of the worst mistakes we can and should avoid? So, I think most folks who make it to this stage, right? Um, they there's not a lot of bombing of interviews, right? It just doesn't happen very often. But I can, because these folks they've done this before. Oftentimes they've been in an interview setting, they've practiced because they know that they need to do that. So you don't see that very often, but I can talk a little bit about mistakes that can be made. And I think I kind of touched on some of these, but I think you want to make sure that you are the thing, like I was saying earlier, the thing that what I equate to kind of a bombing, right, is coming in, not being yourself, not being honest, feeling like you have to be perfect, having a script, not being sort of genuine. I think those are the things that, again, the adcom leaves the room and thinks, I didn't get to know them, I don't know what to make of them. It's really hard at that stage then to say, yes, let's admit them, because there's this sort of gap. They just don't know what you're going to be like. So I think, that's one thing that is I think a big mistake. um you know there's not a lot, I think, other than that. I mean, things to avoid, I touched a little bit earlier when I was talking about my tips, but making sure that you're, having a sort of a mix of and here's where I, did well, and here's where I kind of achieved something, a mix of that with, giving credit to others as well. I think arrogance, is something that the school thinks a lot about and cares a lot about, and they really want to bring good people into the program. You know, Obviously super driven and bright people, but people also who care about others, who are going to care about their classmates, who care about the world, right? So there, you also want to make sure that, and most likely this is not an issue for most folks, but, arrogance is something they think about a lot, and want to make sure that they're avoiding in the people that they're admitting. So I think that's something to just be, wary of. Um, but yeah, otherwise there's not a lot of, big mistakes that I would say that we didn't kind of already touch on. But I hope this was helpful. I know I didn't get to everyone's questions, but hopefully I covered as many as I could. And this was really great. And I thank you guys all so much for, coming and for asking amazing questions. And I hope that this was helpful.